Okay, so hi everybody, and welcome to the first installment in the Biodiversity Caucus's Winter Webinar Series. I do want to start things off by acknowledging that this virtual event is being hosted in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 1725, and these treaties did not deal with the surrender of land, but they did set out the rights and responsibilities that settlers and Mi'kmaq people owe to one another. So as such, we are all treaty people. My name is Cass, and I am currently the network coordinator for the Nova Scotia Environmental Network. NSEN is a network of about 45 environmental organizations across the province whose common purpose is to conserve and enhance the natural environment and build a sustainable future for Nova Scotia. We strive to support, strengthen, and promote the environmental work of our members by connecting them to each other, to governments, and to the public. This winter webinar series is an initiative brought to you by our Biodiversity Caucus. So if you are unfamiliar with the concept of a caucus, it is simply a recurring series of meetings between those who share a common environmental priority. So in this case, biodiversity. One of the most effective ways for NSEN to connect members of the environmental community is through the formation of environmental caucuses. Caucus members join monthly meetings with those working in, volunteering in, or just interested in issues related to biodiversity. At a caucus meeting, you can expect to network and learn about current and upcoming biodiversity-related projects, programs, and events from across the province. And the main purpose of these meetings is just to promote collaboration and advance biodiversity work in Nova Scotia. Anyone who's passionate about protecting biodiversity can join. So whether you're an NGO representative, an academic, or a passionate individual who is eager to make a difference, you are welcome to participate in the group. If you'd like to chat more about the caucus, please feel free to reach out to me anytime at biodiversity@nsenvironmentalnetwork.com. And if you are already convinced, you can complete our short interest form using the link that I will enter into the chat in a couple of minutes. So now I'm very happy to welcome our guest speaker, Hughstin, who is the Terrestrial Project Coordinator with the Nova Scotia Invasive Species Council. Hughstin graduated from St. Mary's University in 2020 with a Master of Applied Science degree in biology, where he studied ways to improve green roof habitat for insect pollinators. So in Hughstin's position with NSISC, he is involved with invasive plant and insect surveys, invasive plant management, and outreach activities. He is passionate about working with communities to engage in discussions about invasive species and what we can do to protect native biodiversity. So with that, I will hand it over to you now, Hughstin.
All right. And thank you so much for that introduction, as well as thank you for everyone who attending the webinar today to listen to me talk about invasive species. So with that, I think I'm going to might as well just jump right into it. There we go. Yeah, so just an overview of what I'll be talking about is first introduce Nova Scotia Invasive Species Council, who we are, talk about what are invasive species, how do they get here, how do they spread, talk about a few examples of invasive species here in Nova Scotia, and I'll kind of end it off by talking about what we can all do to reduce their spread, as well as some key takeaways. So the Nova Scotia Invasive Species Council is a non-for-profit organization and is a provincial chapter of the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. So there's other chapters in other provinces doing similar work that we're doing. So there's one in New Brunswick, PEI, and so on. And so the goal of the Nova Scotia Invasive Species Council is to raise awareness and promote a coordinated response to the threat of invasive species in Nova Scotia. First, though, what are invasive species anyways? Well, an invasive species is any organism that is non-native to the area, spreads rapidly, and causes harm. And so it has to have these main characteristics for it to be considered invasive. So if a species is non-native to an area, that does not automatically mean it's invasive. It also has to have some factor that causes harm, whether it be to the ecosystem, maybe to human health, or maybe purely economically. And so there's many different types of invasive species, and there are many different categories. So again, invertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, fish, birds, mammals, many different types of plants, algae, ferns, mosses, gymnosperms, flowering plants. And so a lot of times we hear a lot of discussion about the animals and plants as invasive species, but pathogens as well can be invasive. Bacteria, fungi, nematodes. One example of this would be white nose syndrome, which decimated our bat populations here in Nova Scotia. And so why do we care about invasive species? Well, one reason is the impacts that they have. And it's widely accepted that invasive species are a huge threat to biodiversity worldwide. Invasive species not only threaten biodiversity, but they also threaten many species at risk and threaten them with extinction. And so they're a threat to biodiversity and species at risk for a few different reasons. One being increased competition for resources. When an invasive species gets into an ecosystem, whether it may be a plant, they are usually very aggressive plants or aggressive organisms that are very competitive. It can take over. And so they're able to outcompete our native species for these resources. Increased predation. So an invasive species can get into an habitat and increase predation pressures on native species. Degrading habitat quality. When invasive plants can get into a habitat, it can take over. And if it takes over and it's just a single plant species present and reducing the biodiversity of the plants, this can have quite a substantial impact on the organisms that rely on such habitat, as now it's not as great of a quality. It can also cause erosion, issues with water quality as well. Invasive species also can introduce diseases. This is particular in regards to some that are in the pet trade. So releasing some of these organisms into the wild can carry pest loads into native populations. And so Canada has committed to conserving 30% of land and water by 2030 to protect our biodiversity. And so preventing and control measures to control the spread of invasive species aligns quite well with these goals. And so here's a few examples of species at risk that are impacted by invasive species. You've got the Blandings turtle, which is threatened by Phragmites, which can alter its critical habitat. Brook floater, which is threatened by invasive fish species such as smallmouth bass and chain pickerel. Black ash, which is threatened by the destructive emerald ash borer. Monarch butterfly, which is threatened by dog strangling vine. And then you have Plymouth gentian, which is a coastal Atlantic flora. Many of these are adapted to low nutrient soils, and increasing nutrient load in areas can make them quite susceptible to invasions, in particular of invasive species. And so this is just a few of them. There are many more species at risk that are threatened by invasive species. And so they don't only just have a negative impact on biodiversity, they also have quite a significant economical cost. And from an economic viewpoint, invasive species can greatly impact productivity in forestry, agriculture, as well as fishing industries. It's estimated the total global cost is about is over $2.1 trillion since 1970. And estimated total Canadian cost is 35 billion, again, since 1970. And so this accounts for damage as well as management efforts. And so invasive species are harmful to infrastructure. For example, Japanese knotweed, as shown in this image here, it's a very powerful plant and can actually push up through asphalt as well as damage foundations. They also can be harmful to human health. Another example in this case is giant hogweed, not giant hoggleweed. There's a typo right there. So giant hogweed. And this species, if sap gets on your skin, And then if the sap is exposed to UV light, can cause quite substantial burns. And invasive species are also harmful to recreational practices, whether it be impeding the ability to do a recreational practice in the area or reducing the aesthetic value of trail systems. For example, multiflora rows, shown in this image here, just taking over, creating a huge wall of it, where prior to there may be more a diverse amount of species present. There's also and so whenever we talk about invasive species, talking about a climate change is also an important thing to discuss, as there is a synergy between climate change and invasive species. Climate change makes ecosystems more susceptible to invasive species, and invasive species can worsen the impacts of climate change. So as our climate shifts, it can expand invasive species ranges. So species that previously with colder climates weren't able to expand more northerly, now with the changing of climate can do so. And you also get examples of sleeper species. So sleeper species are species that are already present in the area. They've already established themselves, but they're not really causing any harm. They're just kind of there coexisting. But as the climate changes, these species, and when their conditions become more favorable, begin to explode their populations and become much more of a significant issue. And this is particular a lot of times in horticultural plant species. Then with increased extreme weather events, these events can create disturbances that increase risks for the establishment of invasive species. For example, increased flooding events, as well as forest fires, can create these disturbances, creating better conditions for invasive species to get into that habitat and take over. So how do invasive species get here in the first place? Well, they get here in many different ways. They can be planted in gardens. So maybe a plant that was quite attractive, it was brought over and planted in a garden for aesthetic reasons. Or maybe the plant may be able to provide some type of food resource. It then escapes cultivation and becomes invasive and taking over ecosystems. Introduced to get rid of other invasive species. This can also sometimes introduce a new invasive species into the area, releasing unwanted pets and dumping aquarium plants. If you're no longer to take care of them anymore, this can also introduce invasive species, introducing new game species, whether this be for fishing or hunting. And then commercial wood imports, as well as shipping, can move invasive species around. They can hitch a ride on these vessels and get to new areas. Once they get to an area, how do they spread? Well, they can spread naturally. And so invasive species can, for example, yellow iris has adapted seeds that will float. And so this allows them to float in waterways and get moved farther away from the parent plant. You get animal dispersal. Multiflora rose is consumed by bird species. Birds will then poop the seeds out in other areas. And then so you get a new population growing quite substantially farther from that original population. And then you also have natural movement. So just the movement of these organisms in the environment. Insects can move around themselves, or maybe it's a fish species that's moving throughout a water system. It's important to note, though, a lot of the spread by naturally is more on a local scale. They usually don't have that widespread or great long distance movement. However, we as humans, though, we contribute to that longer distance movement. And we do this by, they can hitch rides, invasive species can hitch rides on boat trailers, ballast water tanks, seeds stuck in hiking boot treads, seeds stuck in tire treads, or even to our pets. Moving forward can also give invasive species large distances in their spread. and not cleaning off recreational equipment such as fishing gear. And so later on in the presentation, I'll talk about ways that we can reduce the spread of invasive species. But first, I'm going to talk about a few examples of invasive species here in Nova Scotia. This is by no means a complete list. I'm just highlighting a few of the important ones. The first one I'm going to talk about is hemlock woolly adelgid. And so hemlock woolly adelgid is an aphid-like insect that infests hemlock trees. They're a very small insect. In this image here, you can see the actual insect themselves. There's these little dark specks here. And so what they do is they're an immobile insect. So once they clamp down to feed, they do not move. And they feed on the nutrient and water storage cells at the base of hemlock needles. This feeding eventually causes needle loss, stem dieback, and can result in, when these small organisms get into high populations, can kill hemlocks in 4 to 20 years. They are a significant threat to all hemlocks in Nova Scotia. Our hemlocks do not have the ability to combat hemlock woolly adelgid, and so it is quite a significant threat. Hemlocks are also keystone species, and so they play an important role in the environment. Losing these trees could have a devastating impact on vegetation, birds, mammals, and even aquatic organisms that rely on hemlock stands. And so hemlock woolly adelgid was first observed in Nova Scotia in 2017, and it was found in more southern areas of the province. And since then, it has been spreading northerly. Recently, in August 2023, it has been confirmed in 2 new counties, this being Hants as well as Halifax County in Nova Scotia. And so slowing the movement of HWA in the province is really important to reduce the impacts that this species will have on hemlock trees, as the slower the movement is, allows for more trees to be protected. And so with HWA, it spreads by a few different ways. One, by natural means. So wind can disperse them. They can also be moved around on birds or squirrels, but we as humans as well can play quite an important role in the spread. And again, like I was mentioning, usually this can be at quite longer distances by these natural means. So one great way to reduce the spread, in particular of HWA, is using a lint roller. And so just lint rolling down your clothing after you've been to an area that has HWA, and as well as before going to, is important. And so what this does is helps to make sure that you do remove any HWA insects that might be on you. It's also really important to report sightings of HWA so that we can be informed of where it is in the province. So in terms of identification, keep an eye out for white egg sacs that look like wool at the base of hemlock needles, again shown here in this image. You can also keep an eye out for needle loss and fallen branches. And when trees become quite heavily infested, they can turn a yellow to a dull green coloration. There's a few different ways you can sample looking for these, because hemlocks are notoriously very tall trees. And if you're unable to find HWA in the lower branches, that doesn't mean it's not higher up in the tree crown. And so the CFIA as well as DNR have ways to sample using laurel pole arms to reach up in the higher canopy, as well as slingshots to sample up there. But one much easier way to do and much more convenient way to do when you're out for a hike or something like that is just to pick up fallen branches of hemlocks, flip them over, and look for the presence of HWA. In terms of reporting it, HWA should be reported directly to the CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, via their online form. You can also report them directly to us. So on our website, we have a way at the very top right-hand corner. If you click on it, it says report invasive species. You can report it directly to us and we'll send it to where it needs to be, where it needs to go. Okay. Moving on next, we're going to talk about some plants. So the first one is Himalayan blackberry. So this one is a newly observed invasive species in Nova Scotia. It was first observed about 2 years now, and was in Yarmouth County, and has also been now since found as well in Digby County. So those are only 2 counties that Himalayan blackberry is known to be currently in Nova Scotia. It was brought over to North America as a cultivated crop, as it is a blackberry, and it produces quite abundant blackberries. So this blackberry, though, is quite a bit different than our native blackberries. One, its size. So it's a massive blackberry plant. It grows up to 3 meters tall and produces 5 ankle canes up to 12 meters long that root when the tip of them hit the ground. And so you get this like arching growth pattern associated with this a large blackberry species. They're also kind of semi-evergreen, and I use that word kind of loosely as they hold onto the leaves much longer than our native blackberry species do. They have been observed having their leaves on until January, until a cold snap, basically then they drop them after that. One key characteristic is looking at the leaves on the flowering canes and flipping them over, as they have this fuzzy hairs on the underside that give it a very silver coloration. There is a raspberry that also has a silver coloration, but it is a much smaller plant and it does not have this palmate leaf shape. So the leaflets here are all coming from the exact same point on the leaf. They also have a pinkish color, pinkish white flowers. In this image here, depending on your screen, you may not be able to see the pink coloration. It may just look white to you. But the Himalayan blackberry tends to have this pinkish color, but they can also be just white. Our native blackberries do not have any pink coloration. So if you see pink, then it's very likely to be Himalayan blackberry. So why do we care about this species? Well, it has quite a significant impact on biodiversity. It creates these really large, thorny, dense thickets that outcompete native plant species. Nothing can really grow in there. As you can tell how dense this patch of it is, there's really nothing growing underneath it. It's so large too that it can climb over and into trees. And it also impedes the movement of large mammals. As you can imagine, trying to walk through and move through a thicket with these massive thorns on it, as this cane here is hard to tell in this image here, but it's about the thickness of my thumb. And yeah, so you can imagine it could be quite hard to get through it. And that can also have an impact on us in terms of trying to do recreational activities, going out to go canoe at a lake, because sometimes it does prefer growing along in those riparian edges, and it can make access to these water bodies quite difficult. It's also quite prolific in its spread. It produces abundant seeds, and as well as stem and root fragments can result in spread too. And so if you think you may have seen this species, this one is quite important to report directly to us. We are trying to figure out exactly where it is in the province. So even if you're a little bit unsure, feel free to send us some photos and we can clarify it for you. So here's just a few photos of some of the Himalayan blackberry patches that we found in Yarmouth when we were surveying for it this year. And so you can see that how tall this blackberry patches are. It's almost at the roof level here of this first story home. You can see it here actually growing up over top of this house. It also is growing all along the sides here of this trail system, growing up over top of a guardrail here. And you can see a really dense thicket of it here next to a car parking lot. So the next species I'll be talking about is dog strangling vine. So dog strangling vine is not just one species, but actually two. And these two species are pale swallowwort and a black swallowwort. They're very similar in appearance with one exception, and that's the color of the flowers. So with black swallowwort, it has a much darker coloration, a dark purple, while pale swallowwort is more of a pinker color to its flowers. In terms of identifying dog strangling vine, the flowers are quite key. They produce these very much star-shaped flowers. They also have opposite leaves. So on the stem, the leaves are going opposite from each other. And they're stem twine. So it will twine around any type of structure it can get to grow vertically. So this species was introduced to North America by horticulturalists to be used as vines in public and recreational gardens. And since then, it has escaped cultivation. And so they primarily spread through natural processes such as wind dispersal. They produce abundant seeds, and they are a member of the milkweed family. And so they produce these pods very similar to milkweed plants. They have a lot of fluffy seeds that open up and then are released and are windborne. So with this plant species, it is quite a substantial threat to native plant biodiversity. It can outcompete native species for space, sunlight, water, and nutrients. They also release chemicals from the roots that impede the establishment of other plant species. They're toxic, so insects and other herbivores will avoid dog strangling vine populations and instead focus their attention to native populations. And this species is also a threat to the monarch butterfly. Field evidence suggests that monarchs will lay eggs on this plant species, mistaking it for milkweed. As I mentioned, it is in the milkweed family. And larvae feeding on dog strangling vine impacts the development, resulting in death. So you lose a whole generation there. However, though, if milkweed and dog strangling vine are present in the same ecosystem, they definitely target milkweed quite readily over dog strangling vine, but there still is that potential threat. So here's a map taken from iNaturalist that shows the distribution of dog strangling vine in North America. You can see quite a bit of it in the southern areas of Ontario, as well as in the eastern United States. Luckily, though, for here in Nova Scotia, we only have two known populations of dog strangling vine in the province. They are, though, the two different species. So we have both the pale swallowwort and the dark swallowwort. So this indicates that they were two different introductions. And so because this species isn't as abundant here, we've been focusing our attention trying to control it and preventing it from becoming abundant. And so in late August of this year, Nova Scotia Invasive Species Council employees, as well as several volunteers, some of which were from the Biodiversity Caucus, helped remove 11 full bags of dog strangling vine from the Kentville site. This has been a multi-year project to remove and control dog strangling vine at the site. In particular, a lot of attention has been at the ravine area where we've been removing it by hand. And so in this area, there's been quite a substantial reduction of dog strangling vine. Unfortunately, though, it does appear to be expanding in the area. We found a few patches of it outside of the previous known area this year. And so the community has been quite an important role in this process of tackling and controlling dog strangling vine in the area. They've been super supportive of the project, allowing us to go in their backyards and survey for the plant. And so it's been great working with them. Okay, moving on to the next species, and this is Phragmites. So Phragmites is a perennial wetland grass that can grow up to 5 meters tall. It was introduced in the 1800s by seeds and soil ballots by the horticultural trade. The earliest record in Canada is actually here in Nova Scotia and Annapolis Royal in 1910. And this species spreads primarily through underground rhizomes, above ground stolons, as well as seeds. And intentional planting can also result in the spread of this invasive species. Due to its size, it's quite an impressive plant, and so sometimes is planted for those reasons. One important note, though, is it doesn't quite get to 5 meters here in Nova Scotia. It's more an average between 2 and 3 meters, but there's definitely some stands that are quite high. Okay. And so with Phragmites, though, there's actually a native subspecies. So we have Phragmites australis americanus, which is the native one. Then we have Phragmites australis subspecies australis, which is the invasive. And so these are quite difficult to differentiate between the native and invasive subspecies. And several characteristics should be examined, including stem color. So with the native subspecies, they tend to have a more reddish coloration, while the invasive has more of a tanner color to green. Leaf color can also be useful. Ligule length, which is a small structure here on the inside of the leaf, as well as the seed head can also be quite different between the two. This is one species, though, that we definitely recommend sending to us if you see any observations of it, and we can assist with identification. And so in terms of impacts of invasive Phragmites, it is a very aggressive growing plant species and threatens wetland habitat. It outcompetes native plant species and reduces habitat quality. These stands are very thick. It's very hard to walk through these stands, and other animals as well have hard times moving through it. So for example, the Blanding's turtle, as well as waterfowl, have a hard time moving through these really dense stands of Phragmites. Due to their size, they also can alter ecosystem function of a wetland. They have so much above ground biomass because each year this biomass dies off as the plant goes into dormancy. And so over time, this builds up. The large rhizomes as well, basically what they do is increase the wetland surface level, which decreases water levels in the wetland. It also flattens wetland topography, so it will fill in streams as well as ponds, decreasing that habitat quality. It's also an impact in terms of infrastructure, can invade agricultural fields, as well as block highway sightlines due to its immense size. So we've been doing quite a bit of work with Phragmites and looking forward in the province. We've focused our attention mainly on the 100 series highways as well as trunk routes and collector routes, as the movement on highways is one of the main ways a species is spread around. It gets stuck in snow plows or construction equipment and moves around in these systems. We also use previous records to look for this species and to confirm that it is the invasive subspecies and not the native one. And at each site, we record the measurements and coordinates. So between the two summers of 2022 and 2023, we surveyed quite an extensive area in Nova Scotia, so it's quite a bit of driving. We found a total of 82 stands of invasive Phragmites in the province. 29 previous stands were confirmed to be invasive Phragmites, and we found 53 new stands discovered. So there's quite a bit more Phragmites that was quite a bit of unknown Phragmites in the province. All right, moving on to the last species I'll talk about, and this is zebra mussels. So zebra mussels, unlike the other species I talked about, are not here in Nova Scotia. So just want to make sure that is well known that we do not have them here yet. However, there is a potential threat to Nova Scotia as they have been observed in the Madawaska River near Edmundston, Electrical Dam, and New Brunswick. And so there's a potential for them to be brought over. These are small freshwater mussels that have direct competition for resources in terms of our native mussel species. They can also alter physical and chemical freshwater ecosystems because they are such an efficient filter feeders. And they they have these really sticky basal threads that allow them to attach to surfaces where they can reach really dense colonies that can negatively impact infrastructure. Or forgot to have an image there. That can negatively impact infrastructure, including industrial power generation facilities where they basically just can fill in water intake pipes. Here is an example of some zebra mussels really covering a prop here on a boat. And so we have purchased a boat wash station from O0 Solutions that will be set up on the border between Nova Scotia and Brunswick to help reduce the chances and prevent the spread of, hopefully prevent the spread of zebra mussels into Nova Scotia. And the aim of this is to wash boats as they come across the border, as well as to increase the awareness of zebra mussels and the importance of clean, drain, dry, which I'll be talking about clean, drain, dry program in a few moments. Okay, so how do we get rid of invasive species? Well, eradication is quite expensive, requires a lot of time and a lot of resources. So whenever I talk about invasive species, talking about the invasion curve is an important thing to talk and show. And so right here at the very bottom corner, you get the introduction of the invasive species. And then on the y-axis here, we have area infested and the control costs. And so as time goes on, area infested goes up and the control costs also go up. Usually it takes a bit of time for an invasive species to be observed and detected. And then once it is detected, if it is in these earlier stages of its invasion, eradication is feasible. However, as time progresses, eradication becomes quite unlikely and intense effort is required as the control costs go up quite substantially. Once you get up in the top, though, local control and management are really the only options. Here, we're sitting down here in regards to dog strangling vines. So this is why we've been focusing a lot of attention on it, trying to control this species. However, if we talk about multiflora rose, Japanese knotweed, these species are more up here in the higher area of the invasion curve, where you're really only be able to have efforts in regards to local control and management only. So the best methods for combating invasive species is the prevention of their establishment in the first place. And if they do, management early on can reduce their costs. So we're quite a small organization, and so we focus a lot of our attention to preventing. So preventing the spread of invasive species, but also do some in regards to early detection, rapid response, and management. So for example, the dog strangling vine population. So how do we do this? So how do we try to reduce the spread of invasive species? We have 5 behavior change programs which are implemented to encourage people to change the way they go about their recreational activities or hobbies to help prevent the spread of invasive species. And the first one I'll be talking about, which I mentioned just a short minute ago, is clean, drain, dry. So this one is targeted to boaters, anglers, and hunters and divers who might unintentionally spread invasive species from one body of water to another. When boaters pull their boats on a body of water, they should always inspect the boat and trailer and remove any visible debris, including plants and animals. Otherwise, these hitchhikers can move from one body of water and establish themselves in another. It's also important to note that canoes and other smaller watercraft are also can contribute to the spread of invasive species, as well as gear. So it's not just these larger boats. So it's about cleaning plants, animals, and mud from boats and gear. When you pull it out of the water, drain all water from boats and gear onto land, and dry all parts of the boats and gear completely before launching it into a different body of water, as even just small amounts of water can result in the spread of invasive species. Next one is buy local, burn local. And so moving firewood from one location to another can advertently move forest pests to new areas, resulting in destruction of forests and urban trees. These pests will move slowly on their own, but they can make long distance movements quite quickly if moved on firewood. So it's important that if you go camping, to buy firewood near where you'll be using it and to not to bring it with you, as well as leave any unused firewood at site. So you don't want to bring any firewood home with you, as you can as well spread invasive species back to you as well. So HWA, or hemlock woolly adelgid example, is this, as well as emerald ash borer can move around on our firewood. Play, Clean, Go is another one of our behavior change programs. And so this is about cleaning gear before and after entering a recreational site. So removing plants, insects, and mud from your boots, gear, and pets. Checking tires and bikes, ATVs, remove any plant parts before moving to a new area. So many invasive species, such as this burdock here on this poor dog's head, it has adapted structures on its fruit that allow it to attach itself to fur as well as clothing. And if you don't remove these species, they can easily be spread to new areas. We have also been working with other organizations as well as municipalities to install boot brush stations as a reminder to clean off your boots before and after you leave the site. Then we have our Don't Let It Loose program. And so this targets the pet trade, as many pets and plants can become invasive when released into the wild. Common release pets include goldfish, turtles, bunnies. And so if these become established, they can become an invasive species. Instead of releasing pets into the wild, it's important to find them a new home, as well as do not dump aquarium plants into water bodies. So dry them on land first and then dispose of them. The last program I will be talking about is PlantWise. So PlantWise is about is a program that supports the ornamental or horticultural industry's transition to becoming invasive free, and is helping gardeners in the industry understand what plants are invasive and harmful to our communities and to make plant-wise choices. So it's about understanding these invasive plants, why they are a problem, what we can do to reduce their spread, stop buying and selling invasive plant species, promoting the sale and purchase of non-invasive alternative plants, control or replace invasive plant species, and dispose of unwanted plants or plant material properly. And one component of this is our Grow Me Instead guidebook, which we developed with the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council, as well as the Acadia Botanical Gardens. And so this guidebook includes many common invasive plant species used in the horticultural trade and lists off native alternatives. This book is for free online. You can download it by scanning that QR code. You can also find it on our website. So this link just takes you to the PlantWise page where you can find it there. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about is reporting invasive species. So it's super important to report your observations of invasive species. We're a very small organization, and it's hard to keep track of all the invasive species in the province. And so we rely a lot on community scientists to report their data. And so this can be directly to us at our website or on iNaturalist. This adds important data to be used in map species distribution, We used it for Phragmites. We also have used it for Himalayan blackberry, as well as other projects. And the nice thing about iNaturalist in particular is that if you do make a record, an observation of invasive species, you don't have to know if it is invasive or not. It will automatically be added to our project, where we use this to keep track of invasive species. So what are some key takeaways? So invasive species are devastating biodiversity, harmful to people, and expensive to control. Invasive species are extremely difficult to remove once established. Prevention and reduction of spread is the best management option. Humans play an important role in the spread of invasive species. Therefore, we play an important role in stopping them. I'd like to say thank you to our funders and sponsors who allow for these projects to happen. And thank you to everyone again for attending to listen to me talk about invasive species. I have a QR link up here where you can scan, which will take you to our website so you can sign up for our newsletter, which we release quarterly to give you updates on invasive species in the province. You can also like us on Facebook or follow us on Instagram.
Thanks, Hughstin, for such an engaging and informative presentation. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody else did too. I'm already seeing a question in the chat, so we can move into our Q&A period. So Chris is wondering, does your organization already have or would consider setting up a volunteer citizen science task force, aside from iNaturalist observations, for surveying and/or eradication and management? And is there a comprehensive list of invasive species in Nova Scotia? So 2 questions there.
So it is something that we are currently working on, creating a list of volunteers. So for example, with the volunteer event with the Dogstring and Vine poll, we did put out some calls for that on our newsletter as well as on social media, but we are considering going more towards as well, like you said, there's citizen science task force. And is there a comprehensive list of invasive species in Nova Scotia? So there's a few lists that exist. We have 2 guidebooks. We have the Grow Me Star guidebook, which is specifically targeted on plant species. And we also have a list in our other guidebook, our invasive species in Nova Scotia, or something along those lines, that also has several other invasive species and goes into details of them. Yeah. Hopefully that answers your questions there.
Thanks, Hughstin. Does anybody else have any questions? You can feel free to raise your hand, or you can put it in the chat and I can ask it for you. I can ask a question in the meantime. I did see on the map a couple of the species were found in Cape Breton. That's where I'm based, is in Cape Breton. So I'm just wondering if you happen to know off the top of your head a few of the most common invasive species in this area, or like where I could find that information. Would it be in the same book that you were just talking about?
Specifically to Cape Breton, I know what we don't really quite have anything like specifically for Cape Breton. Unfortunately, like nothing that's like just specific for the island itself. Yeah, I'm just trying to think of woodland angelica, though, is one example of an invasive species that has really kind of taken over and is definitely the hotspot for that invasive species is in Cape Breton. But yeah, I don't quite have just a specific list.
Yeah, thanks, Hughstin. So Kathleen, we have a few more questions. Kathleen is wondering, is there an efficient way to get rid of glossy buckthorn?
So that kind of depends on the size of the population. So if it's a smaller population, they can be most efficiently would be to dig them out But if they are quite well established and are quite dominant in the area, there's a few different means of control. We definitely do not recommend cutting them down, as if you cut down glossy buckthorn, it results, now you've got basically a bunch of shoots coming up. They don't mind being cut and will bounce right back from that. However, though, you can girdle larger trees, so cutting a band into the bark and making sure to not go too deep, but deep enough to get like you don't want to cut into the hardwood of the tree, because if you do start doing that, it will promote that growth like I was talking about. But if you do remove that strip about 5 centimeters to 10 in size there, it can help weaken the tree. And you want to make sure, tree or shrub, should I say, and you want to make sure to get every single stump that is coming up from the base of those roots. Otherwise, that method isn't quite effective. And what this does is over time, it weakens the tree or shrub, reduces the amount of berries and fruit that are produced, and allows it to be more easily pulled down in the following year. You can also get lever devices called extractigators, which are like these large tools that grab onto the base of shrubs and allows you to pull them out a way better, way easier than it is just to pull them out directly. Those are kind of like the upper top tips in terms of removing glossy buckthorn. It's a challenging one to remove.
Jerry is wondering, he says, I think I have Japanese knotweed in my ditch. How might I get rid of it?
So another very difficult one to remove, especially being in a ditch. You're going to, this is going to be, you can impact the flow of the ditch itself. So there's a few different methods. Digging it out is not an option with a Japanese knotweed, especially if it's well established. If it's in smaller population and it's just kind of appeared there, then you can definitely dig it out. But once it starts to get quite large, you have to dig upwards of 3 meters down to get all of those roots, because very small fragments of Japanese knotweed can result in it just coming right back. You can routinely, if it is in a ditch, routinely cutting it back can help keep the population down. If it is done over, I think it was 5 years, it can start to degrade the energy that's in the roots. But this is going to have to be cut on a almost monthly basis, keeping the plants from being, if not even greater than that, keeping them from being able to grow up. You can also tarp it as well. So putting a dark material tarp over top after they've been cut can help bake the root system. However, if you are doing that method, it has to be in full direct sunlight. Herbicides are also an option, but if you are working with near a ditch, then you got the flow of water, which is something you would want to avoid. And as well too, like with a lot of these questions, if there is any, like if you are working with a particular species that you are trying to remove, feel free to send me an email and I can send you a more detailed response than what I am providing.
Eric is wondering if you know if there is a single comprehensive list of all species that are native to the Wabanaki forest. So trees, shrubs, ferns, flowers. And he says, thank you for an interesting talk.
So in terms of, there is, trying to remember off the top of my head, the Atlantic Center for Data Conservation, or Center Atlantic, trying to remember what the acronym stands for. The ACCDC, I think, They have some really good lists of what is considered native to Nova Scotia as well as to New Brunswick. They don't break it down specifically for the Wabanaki Forest in total, but they do provide a good list of what is considered native in the provinces.
She says, I recently heard about an invasive crayfish species being found in a lake in Waverley. Do you know if it has been observed in any other lakes in the province yet?
So I focus a lot more on the terrestrial side of things, but to my knowledge, I don't think it has. But I can also like if you have the I don't know if you have the emails of everyone in here, I can also follow up on that information too.
Yeah, for sure. If anybody does have questions that you do want to get in touch with Hughstin, you can either email him using the email that's up on the screen there, or you can get in touch with us. Just reply to the follow-up email and I can put you in touch with him.
Thank you, Ronald, for the name there.
I think we have time for one more question if anybody else has one. Going once, going twice. All right. So thank you again, Hughstin, and to the Nova Scotia Invasive Species Council for being here tonight and offering such an interesting presentation. And thank you to all who attended. I do want to mention that we have a regular caucus meeting coming up at the end of the month for the Biodiversity Caucus, and that's happening on January 31st from 2 to 3 p.m. So if you're interested in learning more about the caucus and biodiversity issues in Nova Scotia, please feel free to drop in and join us. You can send me an email at nsenvironmentalnetwork.com or join our mailing list. So a recording will be emailed to everyone who registered if you'd like to rewatch the presentation. And as I mentioned earlier tonight, this webinar is part of the Biodiversity Caucus's Winter Webinar Series. So once we finish our call, a short form should open automatically in your browser that has the same questions as the caucus interest form that I talked about. So please take a couple minutes after the call to complete the form if you want to stay in the know on future events and follow the Winter Webinar Series. So thanks again, everybody, for coming.
Yeah, thank you.